Good afternoon, JP Garu.
Good afternoon, Chakravarti Garu.
So I wanted to have a discussion with you on general state of economy with the NDA government versus the UPA government. Personally, I have voted for Narendra Modi in the first term when he first contested. I was particularly attracted with his talk during the election campaign. Minimum government, maximum governance. So I voted for him for the first time. When he contested the first time, I sat out. I did not vote for anybody because I am more right-leaning when it comes to economics. So I could not get myself to vote for a UPA, alliance. And then again, next election is coming up. So I just wanted to pick your brains and have more of a conversation as to what went right, what went wrong in these 2 terms of NDA government.
I think it's a great question. In 2014, many people thought it was a watershed. Essentially, the people who were disgusted with corruption and misgovernance, the people who were angry with continued state dominance undermining economic activity and competition, and of course certain traditionalists who had traditional notions of patriotism, Hindutva, etc., all came together. And Mr. Modi offered a refreshing choice, so it appeared. And certainly, I think in the first term, the economic liberals felt not enough first term. Well, perhaps some attempts were made like bankruptcy code, like labor laws codification and simplification and so on and so forth. There was no significant visible impact to either make the state more effective or more purposive, focus on the state's role, or to give an impetus to economic growth on a long-term basis, or to reduce the role of the state in the economic management of the country. Certainly, I think by 2019, there was some sense of disappointment on the part of the liberals, economic liberals, who wanted to see a more dynamic Indian economy, more competitive Indian economy. But I suppose from their perspective, politics trumps economics in a democracy, in a diverse country. The sense I get is, between 2014 and 2019, the government's effort was not to repeat the mistake of Vajpayee in 2004. The 2004 election was broadly seen as India shining versus Aam Aadmi. And there's actually reason to believe that India was shining. Everything is relative.
The economy was actually doing.
I genuinely believe that it was a bit of a class election. The moment in a poor country you see the electoral battle between the middle classes who see economic growth and the future, and the poorer sections who feel that their lives are not significantly altered. They are not partners in this growth project. Even in rich countries, it's very difficult. In poor countries, it's always a losing proposition for growth. And Mr. Modi, I think, focused on gaining a pro-poor image. When you look back, my sense is, in northern India in particular, where there was never any delivery for the poor of the small welfare programs that are attempted. In the south, we already perfected that. Dr. Rajsekhar Reddy here, NTR earlier, MGR, and DMK, ADMK, in Karnataka.
A lot of populist schemes.
Populist schemes, but well implemented. One is populist schemes being announced, but actually delivered. Whereas in the north, there was very little delivery. For the first time, I think, the focus was on delivery of these schemes so that you get electoral alliance, a strong electoral bias in your favor. I think that he assured. But in the process, except for a few things, genuinely there is no sense of economic liberalism or promoting competition. At least that's the feeling that I have also. So but perhaps post-2019 is slightly better.
Looks like, at least there is a change in thinking.
Yes, last 2-3 years, there have been some attempts.
Because he was accompanied by good economists in the first term, right? Whether it's Panagaria or Subramanian. But then even they were unhappy, right? They left his.
I think every economic liberal in the country who wanted significant improvement, and people like me, in addition to economic management, were keen about governance improvement, whether
Right.
it's anti-corruption strategies or decentralization of power or rule of law, particularly these three areas, or the people who wanted a different kind of an approach to management of rural-urban dichotomy in India and agriculture. I think all of us were disappointed in the first 5 years considerably. I
Right,
publicly
right.
made my own disappointment
Right,
very
right,
open,
Right.
including in the fora of the ruling party and their own allies.
Right. So some of the decisions were disastrous. Whether you take demonetization,
Demonetization certainly was very poorly
and
thought
GST
out.
implementation, and GST still is
GST, I would not blame them too much. I think on the whole, the decision was right. On the whole, they got the states on board. It was done with deliberation and with consensus rather than with bulldozing. And yes, they could have managed better implementation-wise. There were some problems, teething troubles. But if you take a long-term trajectory, GST probably is proving that A, it's viable, B, the industrial class and the business class is embracing that, and C, revenues are now beginning to grow despite the hiccups of the 2 years COVID, etc. So GST is a different category.
okay. So let's
But definitely demonetization, in a variety of ways, if you're objective, you have to conclude that it was an extremely poorly thought out and poorly implemented decision. There's
Right.
no question about it.
So earlier you made a comment about good politics often can lead to bad economics, right? So something
You and I don't agree with that. They see it that way.
right.
But good politics, good economics can go together.
can
is
go
our
together.
argument.
So how did having GST? First thing is, first of all, it goes against the federal spirit with which our constitution came into existence.
I don't agree. I don't agree because
taxation rights of the states have been taken away from the
but
states and
by
centralized.
consent. See, it's not even by parliamentary fiat.
Right. It was
The union and states
constitutional.
sat together for 20 years almost. In every major committee, an opposition finance minister was the chair, not even a ruling party or ruling alliance. Whether Congress was in power or BJP was in power, irrespective of that. I think it was structured very well. Actually, to me, it's a great tribute to federalism. I don't see it as a failing of federalism.
Most of the states I know have went along. Otherwise, it would not have mustered the constitutional amendment, except for Tamil Nadu and maybe one or two other states that have opposed. But still, states have given up their ability to tax at their wish. Does that indicate that the federal spirit in India is diminishing? Because see,
That particular issue does not indicate that.
You
I
don't
know
feel
some people argue that.
right.
GST is not
Because
a...
where is the competition among states? If you centralize for the entire India, see, I hate to take the example of United States all the time, but if you take some of the states in the South today, right, California being a very prosperous state, New York being a large state with a large economy, now Texas, Florida, Carolinas are all reducing their state taxes. In some cases, they don't have state taxes. As a result, there is a shift in industries and movement of people to some of these states. So it is creating a healthy competitive tax environment, right? Healthy regulatory environment where states are competing each other for business. And what happened in GST is that has been taken away and it has been centralized in Delhi, and then the committee of people decide. Now there is no competition between Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Karnataka, Telangana and AP in terms of taxation, in terms of trying to attract businesses.
Let us take issue by issue. First, is it anti-federal? No. Because states and unions sat together for more than a decade. All parties had space there. And they did it by total consensus in the country. In fact, exactly the way in a
I do not deny
polity-
consensus. I am just still questioning.
Let me complete. Second, economically, is it actually beneficial to the country or not? I'm sure you recall the checkposts across each state's border and hundreds of lorries lined up
Yes.
and habitually bribes being paid.
Yes.
Typically in those days, per truck, per day, I'm talking of 25 years ago numbers, 30 years ago numbers. Today multiplied 5 times or 10 times. 200 rupees was the bribe to be paid per truck per day.
Yes.
Not only the money collected, but in order to be able to extort that kind of money, the delays and the harassment that are involved, because you don't pay a bribe unless there is a sufficient pain that is potentially there if you don't pay a bribe. And therefore, the business environment, not only the cost of corruption, but the cost of delays and harassment. And India, one of the great advantages of this multilingual nation coming together is the common market. All the advantage of common market was given up by the stupidity of corruption. Third one, world over, there are many economists who believe that taxation raised to the bottom in order to create incentives for investment is not a very smart idea. There are other ways of encouraging investment, the quality of the labor laws and their implementation, the ease of doing business, the corruption in your state, infrastructure, availability of water and land, and the factors of production. And you actually see it. Pre or post GST, you see states which seem to be relatively positive in these respects, they continue to attract investments. States that are declining in terms of governance and infrastructure are certainly losing investment. So I don't think that competition does not exist. The competition in the form of taxation as an incentive probably does not exist. But I don't know if taxation is the best way, because you cannot go to the bottom in order to get benefits. But you can actually
you can't make tax zero in the current society that we live in. But low taxes do incentivize businesses to compete globally, right? So let's take GST, as you said. Sometimes politics compel politicians to adopt some bad economics. So if they brought GST for the greater good, see, when service tax was introduced, it was just for few services, right? Just handful. Now it is practically everything. Even if you cancel, I think today they said if you cancel a railway ticket, on the cancellation also they want to charge the service fee. When it started, the numbers were so low. Now today, in even core industries, let's take steel, which is an extremely important for India's development, 18%. Cement, 28%. Practically toothbrush, 18%. Toothpaste, 18%. I mean, there is just no end to how much they tax. If you look at automobiles, again, the GST has 1,000 exceptions. Right? So a friend of mine recently brought a Mahindra. 7 lakhs is the cost of the car, and if you added up the taxes, it was 5 lakhs. And the car company makes about maybe 70,000, and the government makes 5 lakh rupees. How does this kind of usurious taxation is helping the economy or the people? It looks like it's bad politics and bad economics.
Unquestionably, sometimes our taxes are regressive.
And on something like thumbs up, 40%.
No, sometimes our taxes are regressive. There's no question about it. While we are much better than what we were, 1970s and 80s, it was terrible. In fact, commodity-wise, in the budget, they used to increase or decrease excise duties. Oftentimes, there was allegations of corruption with some credible evidence, etc. And we all know how some of the big industrial houses of India grew into what they are today, and not through competitiveness, not through innovation.
It's happening even today.
Manipulation. But things are getting better. And not merely this government or that government, whether it is earlier UPA or Congress, or BJP, Vajpayee government, or today, I think there is an improvement overall.
Are they getting better because of the government or despite the government?
No, whatever the reasons, the foundations laid in 1991, P.V. Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh, by and large, the successive governments followed that broad path in terms of economic management and taxation. So this assured taxation, steady taxation rather than every year this topsy-turvy approach has certainly helped. But having said that, look at the bigger picture. While there are anomalies in taxation, our tax GDP ratio is only about 18% of the GDP. Union and states put together. About 12% or so, the union. About 6% or so, give or take 0.5%, 1 percentage point, states. This is all our tax base. Our expenditure is 28-29%. That means 11% borrowings. On occasion like COVID, etc., it's gone up by another 1 or 2%. In some form or other, a relatively painless taxation is necessary to sustain the basic services and infrastructure. My complaint is not so much that they are taxing. My complaint is, where are the services commensurate with the taxes? Where is quality education? Where is healthcare accessible to the people of this country? Where is rule of law and justice? Infrastructure, at least, no, in the last, since Vajpayee's time, there is some improvement, some efforts made. There is a lot of room for improvement, but certainly both roads and the transport sector and electricity are a little better than they were. The electricity management is horrible. We are losing every year. But the basic services of government are terrible. I think that is a bigger problem to me than the fact that they are taxing. I have no quarrel with taxation because taxation is the basis of civilization. Though if you tax without commensurate services, it is brigandage, as Dada Bhai Nauroji said during the British India.
So taxation has been there even in Ramayana. So it is an ancient practice.
So
I don't
in the
deny.
big picture, a 12% taxation by government of India does not seem to be a terrible tax.
Let me, sorry, what percent did you mention?
12%.
12%. So you said GDP to tax is 18%, but the debt or how they finance is another 11%. But that also comes from people. So that's almost like 30%.
Exactly.
30%. So what we get is the first world taxation, third world service.
I am totally in agreement. Therefore, my fight should be...
So it is not 18, it is actually 30%.
Our fight should be twofold. One is, it is always better to raise money by honest taxation than incurring debt for current expenditure. Second, for the money you spend, I demand services and you must improve the quality of services.
Now, let's take the budget also. Almost all the state governments in India, across the board, I'm not saying Telangana or AP, most of the tax revenue goes towards paying employee salaries. The rest comes from central government's contribution for taxes, the share of the state taxes in the central revenue or the tax revenue, and debt. So even in the central government, I was looking at the numbers, almost 25 to 30% is going in taxation, in salaries for government employees. And then Modi wants to add 10 lakh more employees, central government employees. How is this good for the economy?
Why the recent
Why are we paying these kind of salaries? I'll just give you a few examples. Because I live now in rural India, rural areas. In electricity department lineman, the required qualification is 7th class pass, is making 1.5 lakh rupees salary.
I thought 40-50,000.
No, it is not. More than 1 lakh. Some of the senior fellows are now hitting close to 2 lakhs. Now, a government school teacher in my village gets paid more than the best international school in Hyderabad, in the village, right? Anywhere more than 1 lakh, some of them are 1.5 lakh. If you're a headmaster, now it is nearing 2 lakhs. The Food Corporation of India loaders, I don't know if you're aware of this, some of them, the top 300, 400 is 4 to 5 lakh rupees a month. Basta almost, the guy who carries the bags in Food Corporation of India, 4 lakhs, and thousands of them get at least 1 lakh rupee a month. And Food Corporation of India or food subsidy is the largest welfare scheme in the central government today. This is where all the tax money is going. So if I go by your numbers, right, 30% are the people probably who are paying the taxes, right? And there are a lot of people who are not even in the tax net. So I guess people who pay are actually paying 40-50% of their income in taxes. And this is how the money, I feel, the hard-earned money of the people is going waste. Where did this government or the previous governments, where have they tried to fix this?
I am entirely in agreement with you. What happened over the years is because of socialist mumbo jumbo. The notion that employment in government is a virtuous thing and government must be a model employer unrelated to productivity. We enhance the wages in government by a factor of 5. If you take not at the top management level, but at the service delivery level, if X is the wage for a comparable job in the private sector, typically in government, 3 to 5x is the wage. Now, 20% additional wage as an incentive in public services is okay. But 3 times to 5 times, the system simply cannot sustain. On top of it, the service is not there. It now become an entitlement. In fact, in schools alone, for instance, the contractual employees, when they were there in schools, the para teachers, etc., who were paid a nominal amount, oftentimes the criticism is that they were working harder and are available, whereas the person who is getting 1 lakh rupees or 70,000 rupees salary is not available, is not working. Or you have somebody as a proxy at a nominal wage, you put him there and he works on your behalf. So this kind of distortion has happened continually.
Right. So,
and it's a tragedy that the states and the union now talk about employment in government as the source of employment, and they reinforce in the image that employment means in government, And employment means get a monthly wage because you have got a degree or something. Employment means you don't have to deliver anything. And in some cases, employment means it's an opportunity to make extra money illegally.
Right.
I completely agree with you. And I think one day we have to confront this honestly.
Right.
And make the government actually deliver.
Right. So my question to you is, you focus more on taxation, how taxation is necessary. Not only you, even the systems, even the politicians, even those that are ruling the states and at the center are not focusing on controlling the waste, cutting down the size of the government.
I totally agree. In fact, you mentioned some numbers. Government of India numbers, if you look at it, it should disturb any one of us. Take this year, the tax revenues of Government of India that were projected in the budget are 22 lakh crores, 22 trillion rupees. Of that, 16.11 trillion rupees goes to states, various forms of transfers, either Finance Commission devolution, or the so-called centrally sponsored schemes and other programs and grants in aid. 16.11 trillion out of 22. 9.43 trillion is interest payments of Government of India.
Exactly.
Together, the tax revenue is not enough. There's not a rupee. We talked about even salaries.
Right.
Establishment cost is 6 lakh crore rupees, 6 trillion. If you add that, and then pensions over a period of time, what happened is they've gone for index-linked pensions. So your salary draw may have been 10,000, but your pension could be 1 lakh rupees
Right, exactly.
after some time.
Right.
And it's also intergenerational problem.
Right.
Today's generation is forced to pay for the services alleged to have been rendered 30 years ago. Our children are going to be forced to pay for the services rendered to us, if at all they are rendered.
Right.
That's why Vajpayee government came up with an extremely wise solution. It's the Vajpayee government that actually created the foundations for fiscal stability in India. Very, very mature government, even when they had no majority. FRBM Act was during Vajpayee government, 2003.
And states are hating it right now.
But all states at the time adopted, though across the country, there was a political consensus, some wisdom prevailing. Second,
that's one good thing.
The new pension approach, not the old pension, index-linked pension, but the contribution has to be made by the employee and the employer today. So the costs are transparent and it's put away, and you derive from that money. There is no pension liability on the future. Next generation will not be able to pay. But already some states, for instance, Rajasthan went back on that very foolishly. Chhattisgarh is going back on that. State after state, after this consensus, and they've done some good things, they're going back on that. Armed forces, the main reason why Agnipath had to be introduced was this pension liability because of one rank, one pension program. All parties publicly talked about it. This government, this party also talked about it, the party in power today. They implemented it. Finally, they realized most of the money is going for salaries and pensions, not for modernization of armed forces and weaponry and training.
Right.
So there are definitely serious distortions, and the kind of effort Vajpayee government made, we need that redoubled effort across the spectrum in the country.
Right. I mean, we had two great examples, right? 91, PV Narasimha Rao at the helm and completely changing the philosophy of how the economy should be governed, and then Vajpayee. But then the rest of the time, I feel we are going in a wrong direction altogether. But you said, we're going in the right direction.
I am a little more optimistic because democracy is on vicissitudes. Ultimately, you also have to carry the people.
Right. So we can agree to disagree. I accept that. Now the question is, I felt when this NDA government came to power, it was our one chance to start competing with China, to grow the economy at a pace that we could at least catch up. Now we are almost 1/6 of where they are, which is a tragedy if you ask me. Now this is the government that can bring about reform in public sector without having to worry about some of the unions. At least the right wing also has unions, but the left wing is more driven and supported by the unions. Why did it take Modi so many years to even privatize Air India? And now that he privatized Air India, which is a good thing, but it still seems to struggle to get to them. He bailed out BSNL, 1 lakh crores. He bailed out banks, 2 lakh crores.
1,64,000 crores. Actually, the recent announcement of 1.64 lakh crores to the government communications companies, by any standard, extremely unwise. and completely counter to the other things that the government is attempting, because they are beginning to talk about privatization, etc. The Prime Minister is talking about government not doing business very aggressively and very, very clearly. But actions are betraying those sentiments.
You tell me, if it's good politics, how is raising taxes on petrol 12 times and penalize the entire nation better than liquidating BSNL and bailing out with 1.6 lakh crores?
No,
how is that good politics? I don't understand. Can you read? Not only BSNL, I mean, even public sector banks, right? They have lost 7.5 lakh crores in the last, they've written off, not lost. Losses are higher.
In fact, the government has added in the form of capital adequacy about 4 lakh crores in the last 5 years alone. Every year, about 70 to 80,000 crores is being pumped into public sector banks.
Exactly.
Therefore, you are absolutely right. The next generation reform primarily should be not merely other public sector utilities, but banks. Not only that, one bank, HDFC, one private bank, smaller than, of course, SBA, but many other public sector banks, its market cap is larger than all the public sector banks put together. That means market is saying we trust this bank, not all those banks, despite massive deposit bases and so on and so forth. And two, the political interference in lending. Once you are the owner, after all, your local MP or some other person, they call the shots. Therefore, lending has to be to cronies. And therefore, inefficient allocation of resources. And therefore, defaults, non-performing assets. And banks are getting deeper and deeper into the problem. Right. And then you're asking for more and more tax money in a desperately poor country where rule of law, education, healthcare, they're all in shambles.
Right.
So banks must be privatized, and this bogus talk that government owning banks is for the benefit of the people, that must be honestly and systematically be addressed by all of us, not merely the government and the political parties.
And the thing is, we have private banks right next to public sector banks, and we can compare, right, how they're doing. No, but then why is NDA struggling? Why is Modi struggling? Why is not, if this government cannot do it, no government can do it.
I agree with you, and I hope that they will do it. That's
all I know. It's not a question that you could answer, but I'm just...
But not surprisingly, though sadly from our perspective, and this is happening all over the world, unfortunately, in democratic world, very, very often politicians feel tempted to put their short-term political interests above the nation's long-term economic interests. I think that is clearly seen. Therefore, my approach is, shall we shore up their sense of what is right and wrong? Shall we give them confidence? Shall we talk very logically and consistently about the rational steps that are required? Because abusing each other does not help at all. Because the alternative does not seem to be particularly advantageous at this point of time. Because they're not even talking of economic growth.
I agree. That's what I said. So the first time I voted for Modi, second time I couldn't vote for anybody. Now the third time it's coming again, I couldn't get myself to vote for a UPA candidate.
You're absolutely right. And I'm particularly sad because healthcare, for instance, COVID is a fantastic opportunity. There's a great opportunity, and we should have really utilized the opportunity to build a viable healthcare system at a relatively low cost. And India is very lucky to be able to do that. But there's no imagination. Rule of law is in shambles. Everybody knows the problems. Irrespective of the cost, we have to fix it. I don't see any movement at all there. Unquestionably, there are challenges.
So slightly switching the gears. So this is a, supposedly a right-leaning government or right-wing government. More pro-market tendencies. Worldwide, when you see a right-wing government, they are more pro-market than the other side. There is, some encouragement to private sector, but how do you react to set business groups being favored, completely off the charts, right? Everybody says A&A, Ambani and Adani are the two names that keep coming up, right? Whether it's in the case of Jio, documented favoritism. Even in the case of Adani, the airports, the NDA government itself has put that no one entity can run more than 3 or 5 airports. I don't remember the number. And right then it was violated to help one person. There's a lot of talk about, coal coming from Australia. The government placed a regulation that 10% of imported coal should be used. And then the contract goes to, Adani coming from to import coal from Australia. How do you explain? Why would they go so one-sided in helping certain
Now,
businesses.
how many
and
of
it
these
is-
are conjectures and rumors, how many are truth, I cannot verify, but undoubtedly, there is a widespread feeling that certain industrial groups are being favored, that competition is being eroded. And companies are oftentimes arm-twisted to hand over the keys to favored groups. And I think there is some reasonable evidence to support some of these contentions. What the government must realize is that apart from the morality, it's obviously immoral and wrong. There's no question about it. Apart from the morality of it, it can never be secret. It undermines your credibility. And to investing community, global investing community, they examine these things with a fine-tooth comb. So whatever your pronouncements in public, if they feel that there is no fair competition, and you will not be treated fairly, and the government will support or side with their favored industrial groups, then investment will dry up. And this is a critical time when China, for whatever reason, is losing steam, and the rest of the world is very worried about a belligerent China, a very nationalistic, belligerent and expansive China. And in any case, supply chain disruption after the COVID, people now don't want to put all the eggs in one basket.
True.
India has very conducive conditions. But it appears that India thinks that we are entitled to growth automatically and global investments, irrespective of what we do in the country. I think in real life, it doesn't work like that. While conditions are conducive, the rest of the world wants us to succeed, we have to also prove that investments here are safe and fair, and there is a level playing field. And if that impression, for whatever reason, is eroded across the world, we lose big time. So I think the short-term advantages they see by some amount of favoritism versus the long-term damage to the country, and therefore undermining their own political viability and economic future, I think they're not able to see that. They are compartmentalizing it.
So,
but there is a link. I have no doubt about it.
agreed. So,
Now, they can argue that earlier also there was cronyism, excess duties were all altered, but that's why India failed.
that's why India failed, right? So
we cannot use that argument
exactly.
now.
Till
We are not
90, till 90s, we were a protected economy. We could not import freely. We could not export freely. Maybe there was a little bit of exports allowed freely, but you couldn't export if there was no free market as such. And we have learned that protectionist regimes do not work because economically it was a failed economy.
There's no doubt about it. That's why we were also happy when the farm sector liberalization was announced. But perhaps either the style, maybe Narasimha Rao's style, even as you're taking a 180-degree U-turn, you pretend as if it's a continuation of Nehru-Indira Gandhi policies.
Right.
Even if it's dishonest in terms of articulation, maybe there's a wiser strategy, a less offensive way of communicating. Maybe there should have been deeper communication, but certainly the government made earnest attempts. And I think the media and the political elites of the country, they failed the country. For short-term political gains, a message was spread totally insincerely and dishonestly that the farm laws were anti-farmer. I am a great friend of the farmers. The people of Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Karnataka, they all know in how many cases many of us intervened to the benefit of the farmers, including removing the trade barriers internally, removing the illegitimate export bans on rice, for instance, or insistence on, with success, imposing some kind of import duty to reduce the burden on the oilseed farmers in India. So many things. I am absolutely supportive of the farm laws. One of the most tragic things in India is not only have the government had to go back on the farm laws, but a narrative was spread that they were anti-farmer. Right. There was nothing more. That's one of the biggest lies in independent India.
I agree.
And it's a tragic and shameful lie.
Right. That was a very good bill that they brought.
And the media too completely failed. Everybody viewed it from the political prism rather than the farmers' interests and the economic prism of the country. It's a very tragic occurrence.
Yeah, it is quite
and I'm sure
sad
that further dampens the government's order for economic reform and liberalization. That's the tragedy. If politics and economics are not in sync, ultimately it's economic growth and the poverty eradication that suffer. And the people who pay the biggest price are not the rich, it's the poor.
A country that has seen a protectionist regime destroy our economy, now again says, make in India. Make in India goes against the ethos of free trade. If you can't make everything in India, right? I mean, today they are talking about the chip industry. Many companies globally are looking for an alternate location to chip industry, to China. But the components, the material that comes from all over the world, Russia supplies raw material, Japan makes the fabrication machines to make the chips, Taiwan specializes in something, Korea specializes in something. Yet we believe in Make in India, and this government has imposed new restrictions on imports, right? So they say Make in India, and they've imposed new custom duties on toys, electronics, phone components, furniture, everything. So it almost feels like we are going back under an NDA government. See, if you say UPA, I can understand.
I take broadly the view that you are taking, and Arvind Panagaria makes the same point that import restriction or imposing high tariff barriers is not a smart thing, because without imports you cannot export,
right?
And your quality will not improve, you will not become more competitive. But at the same time, selectively there is also a case for protection for a period. Because if you expose all our production forces in the country to international competition, because of the past sins we have committed and made our producers uncompetitive, that also will be destructive. So some measure of protection, for instance, oil seeds, if the farmers get protection from through excise duty or import duty, I welcome it. Because otherwise India will be forever dependent on this very vital food. India is the biggest importer of oil and pulses, and we have to promote indigenous production. But without stopping imports, we have to have some protection for some time. It can't be permanent, and it can't be so high that it kills all competition whatsoever. Similarly, in selective sectors, I fully understand. But if you think that Swadeshi is an acceptable economic alternative to global competition in today's age, obviously it is not. It's detrimental to the future. I think part of it is more style than substance, because actually if you see the imports are growing in our country.
Exports are growing too.
Exports are growing too, but imports are growing much faster than exports. Exports have reached last year maybe the highest, I don't know whether that will repeat or not, 400 billion. Imports probably are more than 600 billion, maybe 650 billion or something. So we are almost $1 trillion international trade now. One of the few countries now in the world with $1 trillion trade, because we simply are a large economy. But imports are growing. It's not that imports are restricted. But perhaps there is a case for a group of experts to decide whether some of the protective tariffs are protective or they're actually destructive. I completely agree with you. But in the broader sense, I think still there is an awareness that we have to do business with the rest of the world. I don't think that the government's intention is to stop all imports or to make, for instance, semiconductor industry entirely domestic. It's not possible.
Unless I was just giving you as an example, right? But what I'm saying, when you say Make in India, and I believe there are 3,600 tariff lines on which now there are restrictions. Now they're even going as far as putting restrictions on aluminum and copper imports, the raw ore. I fear what will happen once you open that Pandora's box. Now the government is open to lobbying from interest groups to get their protection.
It will be 1980s India. 1980s,
exactly. So once you open it, it's a downhill from there.
Pranab Mukherjee was the finance minister, and there was a feeling that everything was tweaked.
Right.
And that should never repeat itself. If you go back to that, whatever be the pretext, it's extremely dangerous. For instance, in the import of oil, or palm oil, cooking oil, right. Preventing refined oil from coming into the country, I can understand, because we also want to protect our industry. But what they're doing is, not merely refined oil, crude oil they allowed free import. Mm-hmm. They removed all the tariffs. They'll hurt the farmers. Refined oil, they're now stopping it. So you're only protecting the industry. But there's also a farm sector in India. Mm-hmm. Even today, 46% of people depend entirely on agriculture. 65% of people still live entirely in villages. And India in the long term requires food security. So somewhere the right hand doesn't seem to know what the left hand is doing.
Right. I mean, economy is very complex to engineer.
So if one element of Indian economy benefits, if another element loses, it's not going to help the country. We must take a balanced view. Right. And certainly in some areas, I don't have expertise in a whole lot of international trade areas, but the few areas I understand, there are some causes of concern.
So as I was coming over to see you to have this conversation, as you're already aware, there's a lot of debate between UPA and NDA. I quickly ran some numbers, right? 7 years of NDA versus 7 years of UPA, because 2022, all the numbers are not out yet. So till 2021, that's 7 years of NDA. And if I look at it, under UPA, the last 7 years of UPA, the GDP has gone up 58% in 7 years, 42 in NDA, 42%. Now, there is COVID in there, right? So even if you take COVID out, then probably it will come to 50 somewhere nearby, but NDA is underperforming there. Unemployment, though there is a lot of talk in some quarters, the unemployment spiking, but generally I'm seeing, during COVID it went to 8 and 6, but hovering in 5 and 6%, both UPA and NDA, unemployment. Public debt, under UPA, in the last 7 years, it went up 90%. Public debt, the total debt, right, the government debt, including the external debt, went up 90%. Under NDA, it went up 95%. So almost about the same. The budget, the government expenditure, how much it is spending every year. Under 7 years of UPA, it went up 87%. Under NDA, it went up 93%. Inflation, hovering between 8-10% under UPA. Actually, NDA did better. Though there's so much talk about inflation, NDA is doing better on inflation in the 5% range, except again when the COVID came and the government has to pump in. Exports, same thing, 58 to 60% increase. So it's practically, if you take, barring the inflation number, in terms of numbers, I don't see much difference between UPA and NDA.
What it means is that
now the question is, how is this better?
It's easier possible to rank because the circumstances change dramatically. As the Chinese proverb says, the river is never the same. It's a flowing water. The river today is not the same as yesterday. 2000, Vajpayee's momentum, thanks to the reform impulses of Vajpayee, that helped the UPA government immensely. 2004 to 9 was a boom time.
Right.
Until the global meltdown because of the banking crisis and American mortgage crisis, housing mortgage crisis that spilled out to the whole world, that was a boom time. That government benefited immensely from that. Essentially, there's always a lag time between the government's initiatives and the economic growth. And I think Vajpayee government did a great service to its successor government by creating the platform. And therefore, the revenues shot up, growth rate went up, employment went up, poverty was coming down. There was a general feeling of good.
Yes.
And therefore, they could afford to go for all kinds of entitlement programs and taking care of the anti-poverty part of it. Some of them ill-advised, some of them well-advised, but it was possible. Post-2009, two things happened. One is the global economic crisis. And the other thing that was advantageous during that period was oil prices were moderate. But post-2009, unfortunately, oil prices suddenly shot up. At the same time, there was a global meltdown, therefore growth rates generally plummeted. Therefore, 2009 to 14, for varying reasons and varying periods, economically we were not that happy. And of course, corruption certainly messed up the government's credibility, etc. Post 2014, for some time at least, the advantage of the oil prices fell down again. But the global growth momentum was not that great yet. And the government's own self-induced injuries, for instance, the demonetization, ill-advised, implemented in the worst possible way, that certainly had an impact on the economic management of the country, apart from external factors. And of course, 2019 onwards, the COVID created a tremendous problem across the world, and post-COVID, we still have the supply chain constraints. So I don't think we can compare fairly. But I would make two broad points. Some efforts are made to pursue market economy-oriented policies, bankruptcy court, labor laws, and some infrastructure improvements honestly attempted. Some aggressive steps to try and bring in some big sectors of the economy, big investment into the country, from mobile phones to chips. As a general policy, I welcome, though there are some difficulties sectorally, but I'm not an expert to go into details. I think that's broadly welcome. But the second part is, as you said, the difficulties created because of the notion that ultimately Swadeshi is the right thing, and some amount of xenophobia in our thinking and in our policy formulation perhaps is going to hurt us. The third thing that I see is that real improvements that are required, apart from infrastructure where the government is making earnest attempts. I think we have to concede that. Both Vajpayee government, then now current NDA government. NDA governments have been good with infrastructure. Congress and UPA governments have not paid that much attention. They continued the past policies, but very moderately, without any great ambition. But certainly they are making some efforts about improvement of infrastructure. But the real importance of rule of law, equitable and fair treatment, that the law will treat everybody equally, the government will not tilt the scales, that confidence is not generated. And there is still far too much of centralization. The states are coming to their own, but the third tier of government and the city management, which are critical for the future of India, because cities are the hotbeds of investment. They are the job creators. And unless you are Bengaluru, you are Visakhapatnam, you are Hyderabad, you are Chennai, you are Delhi and you are Mumbai, unless the great cities of India can be managed much better and powers are decentralized, it's going to be a problem in the long term. And finally, there is not enough understanding of what's happening to rural India and urban India. Large-scale migration of unskilled poor to distant cities is a disaster. You have seen in the height of COVID what happened when suddenly employment here suffered in the unorganized sector and millions of people had to walk in the hot sun. I think it's seared in our memories permanently.
Right.
Apart from the moral, if it doesn't persuade us morally that it is wrong, economically, if we don't see a way of managing urbanization, not through diktat, not through planning, but creating some inducement, some nudging by building better infrastructure in small towns so that in situ urbanization takes place and only the highly skilled people will migrate to big cities, but not the low skilled people. We are going to have a tremendous crisis in this country in urban India and therefore economic management in the future. I don't see any sense that the government is getting it. The bureaucratic part, a political part. Right. And I don't see that sense across the political parties. The bankruptcy of India is
they're all equally bad.
It's very...
So as a country, we haven't grounded ourselves ideologically in terms of whether we should...
And economic growth is not yet a part of our DNA. That is the most central thing, that we must pursue growth at any cost.
Right.
The current government at least is saying that. In some respects is walking the talk, but not enough. And
in the second term, there is more talk about
it. But across the parties, somehow the feeling is we have arrived, we have now to redistribute. Redistribute what? Poverty? Without incomes? If more than 1 crore youngsters are coming to the job market every year, organized sector jobs are no more than a few lakhs in the country. And the silly notion that you give government jobs is a disaster for the country.
It's right next door. We have Taiwan, we have Singapore, we have South Korea. Then people used to say, those are small countries. We can't compare ourselves with them. You know, their challenges are different. We are a huge, diverse country and it's very difficult to manage this behemoth. And then came China. And China went from the 80s, China was behind us. Now we've seen China, we've seen Taiwan, we've seen South Korea, we've seen Hong Kong, we've seen Singapore. They are neighbors. Why do we Indians refuse to learn from them?
I think we believe too much in Indian exceptionalism. As you said rightly, if you show Singapore or South Korea, they say small countries. If you say show China, they say dictatorial country.
Dictatorship.
And if you say some other country, you have some other excuse. Bangladesh is growing very fast in recent years. Right. And there at least you have no excuse whatsoever.
Yeah. Per capita GDP is higher than India today.
Bangladesh is, in terms of nature, it's perhaps the most cursed country. The floods and the cyclones and the enormity of the challenges there and the abject poverty. And of course, the same problems as we have monumental corruption. It's not even politically better managed country. But just by doing a few things right, Bangladesh actually is showing better now. So what it means is that there is, I think, in the Indian intellectual debate, not only political, but even on the TV, etc., a notion that we are alone. We are frogs in the well. We have no idea what's happening in the rest of the world. Actually, I'm always struck by this. My work mainly is not economy, but governance reforms. But in terms of governance, what other countries are doing, in some respects, how they're doing much better, maybe we could actually learn from that, is not an idea that occurs to us. We only look at ourselves, lament the problems all the time. We do all this chest beating and all this shouting, but we don't want to look at a solution. When I first visited in 2001 Kenya, I monitored the election for the first time after 27 years. There was a presidential election after Daniel Arap Moi, the dictator. and there was also parliamentary election, local government election, all on the same day. There are some features of Kenyan election which struck me as very, very interesting, and actually we can learn from them. Despite having no democratic experience, remember, they were a dictatorship until that time. They had a primary election in the party conducted by the election commission, in which the dictator president's son lost and could not become parliamentary candidate. A country which had no democratic experience had institutionalized that practice. We are in 2022 today. You try and make anybody understand what it actually means. And when I try to tell people, they say, no, what do they know about elections? We are the best in the world about elections. So we have this frog in the well attitude. And we don't look at the world around us and see what are the things that can be adopted. Not that everything can be adopted. We have to adapt it to our conditions, our requirements. But we are human beings. We are not that different from the rest of the world. If South Korea did a few things, they did a few things wrong, and later they did a few things right. We did a few things wrong. 1955, for instance, Milton Friedman came to India at the request of Government of India. Nehru's government, despite being somewhat xenophobic and socialist, invited a market fundamentalist to come and advise them. And he came up with a plan. We rejected it foolishly. Had we embraced it in 1955, how wonderful the country would have been.
Whereas Hong Kong and Singapore did.
Exactly. Had we decentralized power, for instance, had we instituted rule of law, had the government stuck to its main job. So we somehow have a notion that we are unique, we are exceptional. Yes, each country's culture is unique, history is unique, but economic laws are universal, physical laws are universal, medical science is universal.
Yeah. Thank you, JP Garu. Thank you for your time and wonderful exchange of views.
It's a great conversation, but let's be optimistic. I'm a great optimist. I believe that things still, on the whole, are getting better, but they could get a lot better much faster.
Let us hope so. Thank you.